Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm really glad to be back with you tonight for this book talk. Please say hello in the chat box. As usual, we love to know who is in the room with us, so make sure to chat to everyone. Also, the chat box is where you should ask your questions, and we will try to bring them in into our conversation. So please, we love to hear the comments and thoughts of people who are with us. A few words about JWA for anyone who's new to us. We are a digital archive that expands and transforms the way we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. And we also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. We do all of this because we feel very strongly that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story helps us create a better world. So thank you for your partnership in that work. The book talks are just one part of the many, many things that JWA does. So please go to jwa.org, check out the full range of projects and resources that we offer. A very quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, there should be a button at the bottom of your screen that says CC or show captions. And if you click that, it will turn them on for you. I can't turn them on for you, but it is there as an option. I am truly delighted to introduce our featured author for this evening. Dr. Susan Kahn is the Associate Director at the Julis Rabinowitz Program on Jewish and Israeli Law at Harvard Law School. She has published in Science Studies, Animal Studies, and Jewish Studies, and her book, Reproducing Jews, A Cultural Account of Assisted Conception in Israel, won a National Jewish Book Award, as well as the Eileen Basker Prize for Outstanding Research in Gender and Health from the American Anthropological Association. And I'm very excited tonight to talk to her about her latest book, Canine Pioneer, The Extraordinary Life of Rudolphina Menzel. Welcome, Sue. Really glad to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Judith. I'm delighted to be here, and I can't think of a better venue to talk about the extraordinary life of Rudolphina Menzel than at the Jewish Women's Archive. So I'm really grateful for the opportunity and look forward to your questions and everybody's questions.
And I have to say, you know, this is a great opportunity for us because I'm a little embarrassed to say we don't actually have Rudolphina Menzel in the archive. And that is unusual. It's unusual that we're hosting a program and we really have no trace of the person on our site. But that's why it is so important that you wrote this book and why I'm really, really glad that we have this chance to talk about it. And we will have to fix that. We're going to have to hit you up for an encyclopedia entry about her.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I hope it just as a footnote, you know, if there are any young people out there, working on this story was a great example of how you never know what you don't know. And people, I know from talking to students in the past, they think, oh, you know, everything's already been done. You just have no idea what lays out there waiting to be uncovered. So I hope that this story serves as some sort of inspiration. I'm letting my dog bark in the background just to give the story some sense of authenticity here.
Excellent. Well,
if
everyone
should feel
everybody should feel comfortable to bring their dogs into the conversation tonight. Mine is downstairs because she would not let me sit on this couch because she doesn't like this couch for some reason. But you know, we were thinking at the end we should have a slideshow of all the JWA dogs. I didn't get that together, but maybe for another time.
Perfect.
So, Sue, why don't you start us off with a little introduction about Rudolphina?
Okay, so what I thought I would do is show you, I have a million slides, but I'm only going to show you about 14 just to situate us in this story and hopefully to spark your interest a little bit. I'm going to be telling the story of a woman named Rudolphina Menzel. Her dates are 1891 to 1973. And she was born in Vienna, down the street from Freud, as a matter of fact, and very much part of that cosmopolitan elite, that fin de siècle, wonderful bourgeois cosmopolitan world that many of us know so much about. And she died in Haifa in 1973. So just to give you a little bit of a situate her a little bit, and let me, I'm going to share my screen here. Just have a couple of select slides that I'm hoping will give you a little bit of visual, you know, a visual idea of what we're dealing with here, who we're dealing with.
It's always nice to see some images.
Okay, so this is the, can you see that?
Yes.
Okay, that's the cover of the book that you're published by Brandeis University Press. And I think they did a really nice job with the cover. And that's a picture of Rudolphina and one of her boxers in about 1923. But I'm going to start with hopefully, one, of course, with this picture. This is a picture of teenage Rudolphina, and I just invite you to look deeply into this face. Anybody who's ever had or been around adolescent girls, I think, is very familiar with this truculent, determined expression. I certainly was drawn to this picture as I was writing this book when my own teenage daughter was roaming around in the background, um, often with this expression on her face. And I actually think it conveys something about that. This is a picture of Rudolphina in her teenage years, conveys something about the sort of character that we're dealing with. I also think you can read in her face an enormous amount of intelligence because she really was quite brilliant. And that's something that I actually went into in some depth in the book, was trying to give some examples of really her extraordinary scientific output. She got her PhD at the University of Vienna in chemistry in 1914, and published in chemistry, and is quite an accomplished scientist. But while she was at the University of Vienna, she also had the opportunity to persuade the all-male Theodor Herzl Zionist College Club to let her enter. This is a picture, you see her face circled there. This is a picture of the Theodor Herzl College Club at the University of Vienna sometime around 1912, 1913. And Rudolphina met her husband, the devoted Rudolph. Yes, his name was Rudolph, and yes, her name was Rudolphina. And they met in this college club. He became a doctor. I'm not really going to have time. I'm happy to talk about him and their partnership at greater length because it was really so central to her life. But it was one of those extraordinary intellectual complementary marriages where they really were great. They were really quite a strong pair. He was a great champion of hers, and she never could have done anything she did without him. In any case, so the young Menzel couple meet at the University of Vienna in 1912 approximately. They both are obviously fighting in various ways and involved on the Austro-Hungarian side during World War I. And after the war, they settle in Linz, which is at the time was a small provincial town on the outskirts. Well, they ended up settling on the outskirts of Linz, but many of you are familiar with Linz. Hitler actually grew up in Linz, home of the Linzer Tort. And it was at that time in the early 1920s that Rudolphina, here pictured with her beloved dog Mowgli, named after the Rudyard Kipling character, she adopted her first dog. She'd never had a dog before. Here she is, this young, very brilliant chemist. She adopts a dog, and she becomes fascinated with all things canine, with canine psychology, training, genetics. It was a burgeoning area of interest in the interwar period in Central Europe. It was a field called kynology, Cynology. And Rudolphina very quickly became a kynologist of international renown. She was famous all over Europe in the interwar period as really one of the foremost breeders, trainers, and researchers of everything having to do with dogs. And I go into in the book, I go into some detail about, as I mentioned, about the kind of research that she does, but I just want to emphasize that, many of us have dogs, many of us get puppies, we love our dogs, we have companion dogs. Very few of us devote ourselves to becoming kynologists of international renown and inventing ways of understanding canine psychology in order to perfect service dog training in the kind of profound and elaborate way that Rudolphina did. And I'll go into that in a little bit of depth in a moment. So here she is with Mowgli, and Mowgli really provided the gateway. Her love for Mowgli, her passion for Mowgli provided a gateway to this entirely new scientific career for Rudolphina. she and Rudolph, pictured here with two of their companion boxer dogs. For those of you who know something about dogs, this is a very pugnacious, actually an excellent house dog as well. She became very devoted to boxers. This is a picture of Rudolphina and Rudolph at their home in Linz, and those are Rudolph's parents in between them. And I just like this picture because of the expression on Rudolph's parents' faces, because they are clearly looking at each other, wondering, what the hell did our son get himself into with this woman? And of course, Rudolphina is looking, has her characteristically determined and intelligent expression. They're living in Linz. Rudolph is working as a doctor, and Rudolphina sets up a kennel that she names B'nai Satan, which is, for those of you who know Hebrew, which is, it means children of the devil. And here's a picture of Rudolphina and Rudolph with three of their boxer dogs. This kennel housed up to 60 dogs at a time. And it not only became one of the preeminent kennels for training police and guard dogs, it became her research laboratory for understanding. She designed an extraordinarily ambitious longitudinal research study in which she was interested in understanding the genetic interplay between genes and environment, and how they produced behavioral differences amongst boxers. And she ended up conducting this study over successive generations and over 1,000 boxer puppies, weighing, measuring, and evaluating their development every single day for the first 10 months of their lives and over a period of 16 years. It was a study that allowed her to collect an extraordinary amount of data, which she published in all kinds of interesting scientific journals. It also made her become an extremely sought-after consultant all over interwar Europe, and it wasn't long before she was one of the principal guests at a military training facility outside of Berlin called Kummersdorf, which was the Weimar Republic's premier training facility for police dogs. And just I will foreshadow the question, happy to go into it later. Yes, dogs trained according to Rudolphina's research methods and techniques were the dogs that were ultimately used by the Nazis. And she, after the war, was painfully aware of that fact. But because she was known as one of the foremost breeders, trainers, and psychologists of dogs, she bred extremely effective guard and police dogs who exhibited all of the ideal qualities that you want in such a service dog. She was, a sought-after guest, as I said, at Kummersdorf, and she also was one of the leading kynologists in the Austrian Kynological Association. And I have this picture here, which is, it gives you some sense of the kind of company she was keeping in the interwar years. And Rudolphina stands out as this short Jewish woman amongst all these petty bourgeois Gentiles who were overwhelmingly the kind of people who were breeding dogs. This is, these people were involved in canine sports more broadly, and this was a very exciting time in the world of dog sports and kynological research. So there's Rudolphina. I should add, and I will go in. I can go into this in greater length in the questions. She was at the time also an unrepentant Zionist and an out Zionist, and never made a secret of her Zionism or of her Jewishness. And she was actively, at the same time she was breeding and training dogs for military and police units all over Central Europe, she was actively trying to convince the Yishuv to train dogs to provide security to remote Jewish settlements in the Yishuv in the 1920s and 30s. Now, that part of the story is parallel to her scientific research career in Austria, and it's fascinating. Happy to go into it. I will go into it in more detail in a moment, as it manifested after she immigrated to Palestine in 1938. after she was forced to immigrate for obvious reasons. So here she is, though, in happier days in Austria. She's simultaneously, as I said, trying to convince Yishuv leaders to use dogs as a form really as a proto form of the Iron Dome, right? To guard the perimeters of Jewish settlements, to protect Jewish fields, orchards, etc., agricultural installments that were being raided and sabotaged by Arabs. She understood the kind of security threats that Jews were facing in the Yishuv, and she understood how dogs could provide really unprecedented and necessary security. So that was really her Zionist mission. But she's still in Europe so she starts this letter writing campaign. She's simultaneously trying to persuade the leaders of the Yishuv to train dogs to guard their settlements. And we can go into some depth why they may have been resistant to that idea. I think we're all familiar with some of the traditional Jewish cultural beliefs about dogs, fear of dogs, etc. But Rudolphina was really determined to persuade these Jews, these Zionist Jews in Palestine at the time, most of whom were descendants of Jews from the shtetl, that they had to think about dogs as workers and not simply as companion dogs. That was a distinction that created a lot of tension when she finally immigrated to Palestine. In any case, I just want to fast forward to 1935. This just out of interest. This was the World Kynological Congress that was held under the Nazi auspices in Frankfurt in 1935. It was really a forerunner to the Olympics that were held in Berlin in 1936, kind of an opportunity for the Nazis to showcase their greatness on an international stage. Over 3,300 dogs were exhibited. In addition to the simultaneous scientific congress that was held at the time, I should add at the dog show, unsurprisingly, Hitler's dog won first place. Hitler, as you know, is a great dog lover. But Rudolphina and Rudolph were invited to present their scientific research at this Congress. This is actually a picture of the scientific Congress that was held at the World Kynological Congress. People came from all over Europe to Frankfurt in 1935. And Rudolph gave the talk, but it was all based on Rudolphina's research. And they took this opportunity to, in front of all these Nazis, heretically declare that there was, based on their research on canine genetics, there was no such thing as race, that race was a complete fabrication. And they paid a price for that. But this was the kind of milieu that she was functioning in as a professional. And she had a lot of Nazi friends because a lot of them were dog lovers, which, provided some very interesting wrinkles to her story. 1938, she immigrates to Palestine. She immediately, the Jewish agency at the time gives her and Rudolph a house in Kiryat Motzkin in Haifa Bay, north of Haifa. And she immediately puts a sign on the wall that says, on the fence outside her house, that you can read here, perhaps, it says, the Palestine Research Institute for Canine Psychology and Training. She sets out to create the entire canine infrastructure in Palestine at the time. This was an extremely ambitious undertaking. She started running dog training courses. She wrote a 200-page Hebrew language dog training manual. She traveled all over the country conducting psychology tests on stray and feral dogs to determine if they could function as reliable guard dogs. That's a whole fascinating story that I'm happy to discuss at more time. You can see she's sort of an animal lover more broadly. Here she is with a cat on her shoulder. And I should just add, she and Rudolph wrote two children's books, one in 1933 in German and one in 1968 in Hebrew, that were books about the animal world written for children, to get them to try and think about animals as having human-like emotional states and qualities. And this was part of this kind of broader mission that she had to, familiarize people with the animal world. She was a great animal lover. So 1938, she sets up this Canine Research Institute. She also, as part of this undertaking, she's trying to persuade Jews in the Yishuv to like dogs. She organizes dog shows. She organizes dog parades. She gets lots of children to come in and start socializing with puppies because she realizes that while their parents might be afraid of dogs, they perhaps she'll have better luck with the children. I just want to show you this very quick clip that I pirated from the Israel Film Archive. This is a dog show in Haifa, and it was one of Rudolphina's efforts to try and get Jews in the Yishuv to understand the role that service dogs could play in guarding and protecting settlements. She also, somebody took, these are pictures of companion dogs that often were kept by German-speaking Jews who immigrated to Palestine as part of the Fifth Aliyah. And you can see a number of these dogs are boxers. Rudolphina was a great boxer fan, as I said, and you'll see this is a very short clip. It's going to end in a moment, but they're just some great images of dogs, companion dogs and service dogs. There actually is a picture in here of, you can see Rudolph in the background, but now she's demonstrating all the amazing things dogs can do. And you can see all the people in the background who are kind of observing this with great interest. And I like this because, it's not so easy to climb a wall, as you can see. One of the dogs doesn't make it. So anyway, so that was a dog show in Haifa in 1938. Let me see. Shoot. I want to get us past this. Hold on. Sorry. Let me stop the share. I'll try and move it along here. And then we'll go from there. So at this point, many things happened during World War II, but at this point, she also is raising dogs to fight in the War of Independence. Over 300 dogs fought in the War of Independence. This is a, oh shoot, here we go again. This is why you should never have anthropologists be in charge of PowerPoint presentations. Let me just get out of here, and I'll just run it from my screen. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, thanks for your patience. I appreciate it. Okay, so here's a quick picture of a dog fighting along a Haganah soldier in the 1948 war. I want to show you this clip, which is a very quick one of a victory parade in Tel Aviv. This was a clip of the dog unit marching as part of the victory parade in 1949 through the streets of Tel Aviv. To give you some sense of the way dogs were understood as part of the war effort. And I'm just going to wrap up really quickly here. In 1952, Rudolphina created the first guide dog institute in the Middle East, which became a great obsession. She did this when she was 58 years old, became a great obsession of hers for the last decades of her life. And this is a picture from 1952 with Rudolphina and Helen Keller. She managed to persuade Helen Keller to come to Palestine and deliver the opening remarks at of her, as she called it, the Palestine Lighthouse Foundation for Seeing Eye Dogs. Which she became a researcher on canine perception and a seeing eye dog researcher in the 50s and 60s, of international renown. I want to just show you this very touching picture of Rudolph and Rudolphina in their later years, because you can see something about their, the love that they maintained between them. And I'll just finish with this nice picture of, I think, extremely intelligent, graceful older woman that she evolved into. So there you go. A little bit about Rudolphina Menzel, and thanks for your attention and your patience.
Thank you so much, Sue, for that great introduction. And I have lots of questions, but my first question is really, how did you discover Rudolphina, and how did you get interested in this topic?
You know, it was really by accident. I'm an anthropologist by training, and I actually was doing research about 15 years ago with Bedouin in the Negev, trying to understand something about animal husbandry and the relationship between Bedouins and their animals. And I noticed anybody who's been to Israel has seen these feral, scruffy dogs wandering around, particularly in the desert. And Bedouins tie those dogs up outside their goat enclosures and their tents and use them as kind of canine alarm systems. And I became interested in those kind of feral dogs. And I started asking questions about those dogs. And this Bedouin dog breeder, he was actually breeding Salukis, which are a Bedouin hunting hound. He started telling me about these dogs and that actually there was this crazy Jewish woman who found these dogs and started breeding them and invented Israel's national breed, the Canine dog, based on our Bedouin dogs. And it just became this thread that I started pulling. And then it turned out that there were 160 boxes of Rudolphina's personal materials that had recently been deposited in the Central Zionist Archives. So when I was in Israel, I would go and look around in those. What's the word? The wonderful thing that happened really in terms of doing this research was one, COVID. I sort of had an unexpected sabbatical. And two, I discovered that Rudolphina had written a 265-page German language memoir in 1939 that was sitting down the street from where I live in Houghton Library at Harvard. And I got this memoir, and like two people had ever looked at it, both German language researchers. And so I sat in in front of my computer during COVID, and I should add, I don't speak a word of German, but I typed the entire German language memoir in German into Google Translate.
Wow.
So I had this really long, really bad translation of her memoir, but it was good enough that I could identify sections. And I have a couple of German friends who were really generous with their time and helped me kind of piece together these interesting parts of her story. And it just became one of these it just fell down a rabbit hole and it just got more and more and more and more interesting. And I kept finding more and more material. So I just got really lucky.
Hmm. It's amazing. I loved some of the details of her story. I mean, her story brings together there's so many different narratives there. Like it touches on so many historical, you could go down all these historical rabbit holes in various ways in terms of like, you know, Austrian Jews and the rise of Nazism and Zionism and the founding of the state and women in science and Jews and class and culture and dogs and military strategy and all of that. One of my favorite little details was about the Hebrew dog training guide and how she had to work with someone basically to create the words because there weren't words yet in Hebrew for things like leash or, all the things,
Muzzle,
muzzle or all the things that you
kennel.
would need for that. Right. And I happen to love the Hebrew language and really love the kind of way that modern Hebrew developed. And so to think about also like all of the roles of individuals who had to help Hebrew come up with the words that it needed for them to do their jobs and her piece of that.
Yeah, I mean, she didn't just sort of, she sat, for years with one of the premier philologists of the Hebrew language. She was such a Teutonic character, such a sort of stereotypical Yeke German Jew in terms of her German speaking Jew, in terms of her, her rigor and attention to detail. She wrote this Hebrew language dog training manual, and then she would make anybody who took her dog training courses, these poor kibbutznikim in 1937, who just wanted to learn how to like use a dog to guard the perimeters of their kibbutzim, they had to master all of the theoretical material in her dog training manual before they were allowed to graduate or get a certificate in dog training from her dog training school. So she didn't make a lot of friends that way.
Yeah, sounds like that she was loved by many and not by all. But
Yeah,
one of my other favorite details was that even before she moved to Palestine, because she was this ardent Zionist, she used Hebrew to train her dogs. And so when she was training Germans and like those who became Nazis and the German police to work with dogs, they had to sometimes use Hebrew commands on their dogs, which is just kind of like, oh my God.
exactly. They had to learn Shev, Arza, Bo, etc. And that was interesting to me. One, I think Rudolphina had a great sense of humor, so I think that gave her, no doubt, provided her with great amusement that she was, that these German police officers were having to speak Hebrew with their dogs. If they wanted to use her, terrific dogs, they had to learn how to Hebrew. They had to learn Hebrew in order to use them. But the fact is, if you are training police dogs at the time, the thinking was you had to train them in a language that wasn't the language of the people who were being policed, because you didn't want prisoners, if you had a guard dog guarding prisoners, you didn't want the prisoners to be able to communicate with the dog. So dogs were often trained in a different language. But I just think it was obviously of interest. I mean, she did call her kennel B'nai Satan, and all of her dogs, kennel names, dog names for purebred dogs all have the kennel name in them. So, her dogs were called like Dietmar Ben Satan, right? They all had the kennel name in there. And I should add that, she made a big distinction with her companion dogs between her companion boxers and her service boxers. Her companion boxers were all named after operas. So she had Rigoletto, and she had, uh, yeah, all of her, as a good German Jew, all of her Austrian Jew, all of her companion dogs were named after operas.
Hmm. Well, so we'll get to the German and Nazi piece of her story, but I want to start actually with her Zionism and how did she, I know she came to Zionism as a young woman, but can you tell us a little bit about her journey and whether it was unusual for someone of her background in that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I should say that, in writing this book and in speaking about it, the book just came out relatively recently, and I've already been accused of dog washing. Not my joke, but I thought a good one. Um, so, Rudolphina, it was very unusual for someone of her background and class to become a Zionist. I mean, bourgeois, cosmopolitan Viennese, Jews were not Zionists. This was just not their thing. I mean, Herzl being the notable exception, obviously. But she came across a copy of Herzl's Die Welt, but quite by chance, in her father's study, and she just became enthralled with it. I mean, I have some psychological theories about why Zionism was so appealing to her, but she was a person of great conviction, and this was something, and she was kind of an autodidact. So she found this discarded copy of Die Welt. She read it, and that was it for her. I mean, she made a commitment to Zionism. She skipped school, lied to her parents, and went to watch Herzl's funeral wind its way through the streets of Vienna, and I think it was 1904. And she was very outspoken about her Zionism from a very, very young age. I mean, it was a commitment that she was unwavering throughout her life. But she developed, she also was a very, very devoted and committed socialist, also an ideological commitment that put her in opposition to her family. That was not something that she got from her family. And at the moments when her socialism and her Zionism were in tension, and there were many moments in her young life when they were in tension, she invariably defaulted to her Zionism. Her
Mhm.
Zionism was the overriding ideological commitment of her life.
Hmm. And how did her family feel about that?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that, after the war, they were, most of her family survived the war, and I managed to interview her grandniece who lives in Elizabeth, New Jersey. I drove down to meet her, and had tons of Rudolphina's stuff, dog show trophies and other kinds of things. They adored her, and they were very, very proud of her in retrospect in the 50s and 60s. And, she came to the States and visited them in the States, etc. There's very little, I mean, I think she had a lot of tension with her family. There was a lot of she was the youngest of four. Her mother died when she was quite young. She hated her stepmother. Her stepmother was really quite a domineering, cold, and in Rudolphina's eyes, uncultured person. So I think she was pretty alienated from them. I think her father was sympathetic because I think her father could recognize he had quite an extraordinary child on his hands. But they certainly didn't become Zionists themselves.
Mhm. And how did they survive the war?
They got out in the 30s. They managed to get out in the 30s. They came to New York.
Mm,
I mean, they were wealthy Viennese Jews, so they had connections and they managed to get out.
right. So we've talked a little bit about how Rudolphina had this kind of complicated relationship with Nazis because she had worked with so many of them and stayed connected to them even into the Nazi period. Um, and also there's the whole piece around the kind of relationship between dog breeding and eugenics. There's
Exactly.
this question of like selecting for particular kinds of traits. So tell us a little bit more about how she navigated some of that question.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, I should just add that the word for dog for breed in German is Rasse, is the same word as race. And all pedigree dog breeders are lay eugenicists, right? They are practicing selective reproduction to produce particular outcomes. So it's practicing lay eugenics is a very familiar and necessary part of pedigree dog breeding. Um, she was not unaware. She goes into this in some length, at some length. She was not unaware of the troubling overlaps between, the philosophy or the ideology of pedigree dog breeding, breeding for particular outcomes, and Nazi ideology. And this the seed and soil kind of blood and soil Nazi ideology. But she also was a scientist, and so she saw that there were traits that are genetically linked. And so, this was something that even today people are constantly kind of struggling with, that nature nurture kind of, dilemma. But she was aware of it. And I did manage to find, some quotes of hers after the war where she very clearly stated, that there has to be a wall between science and politics,
Mhm.
right? That there's one thing to do, animal dog breeding, and it's a very different thing to transpose that into the realm of human society. She was adamant about maintaining that wall.
Mhm.
But yeah, it was complicated. I mean, and her personal relationships, she maintained relationships even after the war with dog breeding friends in Austria and Germany, those who hadn't become totally ardent Nazis. And she entertained Konrad Lorenz in her home, one of the leading, the Nobel Prize winning ethologist. She entertained all kinds of people in her home. She had kind of a canine salon in at her home in Linz, and people from all over, dog lovers from all over the world, from as far away as Hawaii and Egypt, and certainly all over Europe, made pilgrimages to consult with her, and she was sort of a canine oracle.
Yeah, I mean, and then it's so interesting that she goes from that world where she is, you know, in this dog loving world, but where she chooses to go, I mean, she wanted to go to Palestine, but also had to go to Palestine, um, goes to a place where there's actually a lot of fear and kind of distaste towards dogs. So can you tell us a little bit about some of that cultural work that she had to do and what her arguments were, like making the Zionist case for dogs?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I had a lot of fun with this part of it because, I think I would imagine many people in your audience are familiar with, the long-standing cultural and, in fact, grounded in Jewish texts, a real Jewish aversion to dogs, for also because of their uncleanliness, because of their barking. I think there's a text I forget. I can't remember exactly what it is, but their barking alerts people to, alerts your enemies to when you're in hiding. dogs are bad news, and let alone the real cultural facts of, Jews living certainly in Eastern Europe were familiar with dogs only to the extent that Gentiles used them to pursue, attack, and to pursue and attack them. So, and keeping dogs was not a thing that Jews in Eastern Europe did. It certainly wasn't a thing that Jews across North Africa and the Middle East did either. Just wasn't a Jewish thing to do. So you do see, as with greater, after the Haskalah, with greater acculturation, as you move towards Central and Central and Western Europe, you start seeing more acculturated Jews keeping dogs as pets, right? It's part of, so it becomes a bourgeois affectation, particularly, as the Enlightenment is growing, so is bourgeois pet keeping growing in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And having a pet dog that accompanies you, certainly the Parisians were the best at this, right? Who becomes really a companion dog, who's a little sweet dog who, is a source of amusement and pleasure and companionship, etc. So, this was, there were many different ways that people relate to dogs when Rudolphina came on the scene, right? This whole notion of service dogs was a relatively new invention. I mean, the idea of using a dog as a police assistant had in fact originated in Austria in 1896, but it really wasn't until the First World War that dogs were mobilized to be as kind of citizen soldiers, as mine detectors and trackers and guard dogs, et cetera, that this whole notion of using dogs to be kind of service dogs, that kind of modern as sort of citizen, companions to people living in modern nation states began to evolve. Let alone the ways that dogs are being used all over the colonies to guard, protect, attack, police boundaries and people, etc. So you have I think I got a little bit off track there. You have the traditional Jewish aversion to dogs. You have that changing as Jews are moving across, getting more acculturated. And then you have changing notions of dogs more broadly, right? You kind of transpose all of this to Palestine, where you have Jews, as I mentioned, primarily from Eastern Europe, who were primarily the primary Zionists at the time, certainly have no, you know, innate affection for dogs. And you also are kind of trying to transpose a European, Rudolphina was trying to transpose this European notion of the dog into a Palestinian context where people have legitimate fear of dogs. Dogs are rabid, they're full of parasites, they're marauding around garbage dumps. It was like places all over the developing world. Dogs in Palestine at the time were, kind of mangy, rabid, potentially dangerous creatures that were not seen either as potential companions or as potential, service animals.
Right.
So,
Plus for the socialists, they would probably saw any kind of love of dogs as some kind of weird bourgeois affectation.
exactly, and that's a point that I make in the book of that, as Rudolphina is really trying has this kind of cultural challenge of convincing there's Eastern European Jews in the Yishuv, like, think about dogs not as these feral, mangy creatures that are full of ticks, parasites, and rabies. Think about them not as cute little companion dogs that are bourgeois affectations. Think about them as service dogs that are going to be citizen soldiers, and they're going to play real roles in helping you build and protect the nation state. And that particular mission that she set for herself had environmental challenges, had public health challenges, and had huge cultural challenges. And that was one of the reasons that she organized these dog shows and these dog parades. And there are great descriptions that I reproduce in the book of, like, there was a huge dog show in Tel Aviv in 1945, where dogs were invited from all over, came from all over the country to, she wanted to familiarize Jews with dogs. She wanted people to get familiar with dogs. And I should add, there was a real important service dog component to that because dogs are an unusual animal. And in order to produce effective service dogs, you can't like just raise them in a laboratory. You have to socialize them,
Right.
right? They have to be raised in relationships. So you have to raise them ideally in people's homes, right? Where they are fed and protected and interacted with and played with and enjoyed. And then they, they start to see people as part of their pack that they want to protect and it's a very important component of service dog training to socialize dogs in homes, right? To raise puppies in homes. In order to raise puppies in homes, you have to convince people to have puppies in their homes.
Right.
And if people hate dogs, they're not going to do that. And that was a big challenge she also faced in her later iteration in her career when she started to train service dogs because and that engaged a whole other different set of cultural questions because you had all these Jews, the overwhelming number of people of the overwhelming percentage of blind Israelis in the 1950s who were helped by Rudolphina's guide dogs were Jews who were Mizrahi Jews coming from the Middle East and North Africa, and they certainly didn't love Jews. And they were living often in crowded, cramped apartments, with people who didn't want to live with a dog also in the apartment. So, there were a lot of cultural challenges that she faced in really interesting. She came up with all kinds of interesting ways to try and get Jews to love dogs, to not be afraid of dogs, to identify, she developed this 57-page questionnaire for potential students in her guide dog school who could potentially live with a dog. What are
Hmm.
the qualities of a person who could be convinced to get over their fear of dogs?
Right.
So, this was a cultural challenge that she was deeply aware of and really trying to solve.
It was interesting to learn also about how kind of strategic she was in thinking about the ways that dogs could be used you know, for the purpose of improving Jewish settlement in Palestine. So not only the kinds of things like guarding settlements, she did all this work around detecting landmines, teaching dogs to detect landmines and carrying messages and sort of for these like more military police kind of purposes. But also she was very clever in recognizing that she could strengthen relationships between Jews and the British during the Mandate because the British loved dogs and she could help them provide dogs for them and kind of strengthen those relationships. And then when the Mandate was coming to an end and the Haganah was trying to like get rid of the British, she like turned around and also trained the Haganah how to hide their ammunition caches from the British. And I just thought like, wow, this woman is smart on so many levels.
Thank you for your very close reading because I really appreciate that. And Rudolphina founded the Palestine Kennel Club in 1937. She traveled to Palestine twice before she moved there in 1938, in 1934 and 1937. And in 1937, she founded the Palestine Kennel Club primarily with wives of British Mandate officers. And it was the wives of British Mandate officers that she would always enlist to be the judges at her dog shows. So she was very aware, and the British appreciated her canine expertise because they obviously were dog lovers, and they knew they had this world-renowned figure who could really, who could help them. There was a canine corps as part of the Palestine police in the Mandate period, and she served as a consultant for the Palestine Kennel Corps of the Palestine police. But I just will elaborate on that one the one anecdote you mentioned about once the Mandate ended, and once the Haganah, once it became clear that the Mandate was going to end and that the Haganah started stockpiling weapons and ammunition as in anticipation of this unknowable future with the Arabs and what they didn't understand, they didn't know what was going to happen, and having arms and ammunition provided a real advantage. So we're talking in the years between say 45 to 48. So Rudolphina was a chemist, and so chemists understand, and she was an expert in the canine sense of smell and canine olfaction. She'd published widely. She published groundbreaking scientific papers on the canine sense of smell, and so she taught the Haganah how to disguise their ammunition stashes and their weapon stashes so that the British police dogs wouldn't be able to find them.
The
Right?
British police dogs she had trained to smell
She had
things,
trained, exactly,
right?
right. But
To detect mines. They could detect mines, but then she could figure out how to hide the other things.
exactly, she knew she could play both sides of it. So yeah, she had it, and it really quite a remarkable, as you say, quite a remarkable, she was a chess player, right? Quite a remarkable intelligence where she could play many steps ahead.
So say a little bit more also about the service dogs. We have a question about whether she had any role in founding or training the Israel Guide Dog Center for the Blind. And my understanding is she built the whole infrastructure for service dogs in Israel, right?
She did. So I will just say briefly, she didn't have anything to do with the modern canine, the modern Israel Seeing Eye Dog Institute. Her Seeing Eye Dog Institute really kind of came to an end when she passed away in the early 70s, and it wasn't until about 10 or 12 years later that the Israeli Guide Dog Institute was founded. And that real, I mean, they pay homage to her. There's a picture of her there as you walk in, but she didn't, and I think she trained a number of their trainers, but she did not create or lay the groundwork for that exact foundation.
Mhm.
So, you know, I should say, I saw in the chat someone said, "What happened to her Canine Institute?" You know, Rudolphina was a very charismatic person, and she made a lot of friends, but she made a lot of enemies. And you know, she was a sort of a short. Uh, she was a that she was short. I don't mean to be heightist. Her shortness was irrelevant. Come to think of it, she was a German. She spoke a very heavily accented Hebrew, German accented Hebrew. She was a woman, and people got sick. These young, strapping, you know, Israeli guys who she trained to be dog trainers got sick of taking orders from her and got sick of having to memorize the entire 200-page Hebrew language dog training manual and learning everything about the history of canine domestication and the difference between, you know, training and what's the difference between training and how do you, you know, identify behaviors that are the best for training. They just wanted to do their jobs. So she was demoted. Her institute. They stopped funding her institute. The Jewish Agency kind of dismantled her institute, and she did not. She was not an officer in the Haganah's canine corps. She was an educational supervisor, and that really was. They dissed her, right? They demoted her, and it really, you know, I think all of your audience in the Jewish Women's Archive can probably speculate as to why. I mean, you know, they didn't want to take orders from a woman, and particularly from a woman who knew a lot more than they did, and was extremely demanding.
And do you think those are the same kinds of factors that contribute to the fact that she has basically been forgotten, except thankfully you have resurrected her story? I mean, I think that is what was so shocking to me as I was reading this. I was like, how is it that she is not, she touched so many fields, right? Like
Right.
it's just, you know, her scientific discoveries, the infrastructure she built, the military piece, the service dog piece. She wrote a children's book. I mean, all those pieces, it's like you would think that her, I mean, her fingerprints are all over everything, but you would think her name would be remembered, but there really is both culturally and academic, you know, in scholarship, it seems like she's basically been forgotten. So how do you explain that?
Well, you know, that's the exact question. I mean, that there aren't streets named after Rudolphina Menzel. Rudolphina Menzel in Israel is a mystery. I mean, it's not a mystery. I mean, I think she was, uh, you know, she was forgotten. There are dog-loving people in Israel who still remember her.
Mhm.
There are people who, you know, one of my informants for the book was her, you know, her 87-year-old disciple who I interviewed in a old age home in Haifa. Actually, she's older than 87. I don't know. She's actually in her 90s. And she knew Rudolphina in the 1940s and served as her assistant. She remembers her. There are the woman who is sort of the custodian of Israel's national breed, the Canine dog, which is Israel's emissary in the world of dog sports, recognized by the American Kennel Club, etc. Shown in every single dog show, you'll see the Canine dog. Um, Canine dog enthusiasts remember Rudolphina. People at the guide dog school, as I say, pay homage to her, but she is not remembered as as a founding foremother of the Zionist movement, which is astonishing. I mean, she's like Chaim Weitzman and Henrietta Zold rolled into one. Um,
Love that.
and she understood in a prescient way. I mean, I think particularly at this historical moment, she understood the imperative of protecting the perimeters of Jewish settlements. That
And
was her that was her goal, was to train dogs to patrol and protect the perimeters of settlements and orchards, fields, etc.
and what about, we have a question here about, are her ideas about dog psychology and breeding and development, are those still part of the, way things are done? Are those still valid?
Yeah, I go into that in some depth. I mean, this is just another astonishing thing. There's a landmark book that came out in 1965. I have it here. It's called, I'm gonna not I'm misremembering it, but it's about genetics and social personhood of the dog, considered the landmark study on genetics and psychology of the dog, published in 1965. Rudolphina appears in the bibliography. I think R. Menzel appears in the bibliography, just R. Menzel. And her research is referred to in the book, but she herself gets no credit. So many of the questions she was asking, and the interventions that she made, she invented the canine temperament test in
Mm.
1931. This is a test that is now universally used by dog breeders, everybody in dog shelters, to determine whether a dog can go home or not. This whole notion of creating a sort of a personality test for dogs was something she invented. She's totally forgotten.
Mm.
But it was her, this was her original idea.
Um, Dog culture in Israel is very different now. If anyone
Yes.
has been there recently, everyone has a dog. It is shocking to me, who grew up spending a lot of time in Israel at a time where there were not a lot of dogs, and now everybody has a dog. Are dogs still used in some of the ways that I mean, obviously as guide dogs, but are there other ways that dogs, that she was training dogs to be used that are still being used, or have dogs sort of mostly gone into the more bourgeois part of culture in Israel now?
Well, I will say, there are dog parks, dog beaches, there were dog pet shops in Tel Aviv in the early 1940s, but obviously dog loving culture has completely expanded in Israel, partly because all the Russians came, they loved animals when they came in the 90s. There's also great kind of amongst secular Israelis, great kind of conservation mentality, and dog shelters are widespread in Israel. I had the good fortune finally, in just almost a year ago, to visit Oketz, which is the canine corps of the IDF, almost a year ago. Oketz, the canine corps, I mean, any of you who are paying attention to what's going on in Gaza right now, I assume all of you are, if you read very carefully, you will see that the Canine Corps is on the absolute front lines of every single incursion. The dog corps is in front of every single band of soldiers that's going into Gaza. And the Canine Corps of the Israeli Army, which was founded in the Haganah by Rudolphina in the 1940s, then disbanded sort of in the 50s and 60s and reinvented in the 70s, is on the international cutting edge of using dogs as basically as weapons of war.
Hmm.
Right? They are used as weapons of war. They do extremely uh, they're extremely effective. They do very nefarious things. There's a dog cemetery on the Oketz base of the dogs that were killed in battle.
Mm,
And they are on the absolute, they're in front of the front lines,
mm.
in currently in Gaza. And in every single activity of the IDF, certainly in the in the West Bank, etc., dogs are part of that infrastructure. Somebody asked, I think, to see my dog, and he seems to be crawling over here, so I'll bring
Yes,
him.
that's a much better note to end on than on war and military use of dogs, about which I have very mixed feelings, despite
Oh,
my
he
admiration
doesn't
for
want to come.
him.
He doesn't want to come. I'm
He doesn't
sorry.
want
His
to.
name is Solomon, and he's a French bulldog. Maybe he'll come over this way. Hold on. Here he is.
He's very cute. I know him. I've met him before. My dog is downstairs and my kids are ignoring me about letting her in, but that's fine. You'll see her another time because I'll be back. While you try to get Saul on screen. Oh,
Ah,
hello.
there he is. He's bigger than he looks. He's heavy. He's 35 pounds. There he is.
He's super cute.
Yes,
Welcome.
he's not good for anything, sadly. I mean, he doesn't protect, or he's
That's okay. He doesn't have to earn his keep. He can just be
yes.
loved for being a dog.
I do like to say he's the best husband I ever had.
I'm that's not sure what kind of message that is, but we're glad to see him on screen. And I just want to thank you so much, Sue, for teaching us about Rudolphina, for giving us back her history and all the interesting and challenging questions that go along with us. I want to thank everybody who's with us in the room. A great conversation. This is our last book talk for the month, but next Thursday we kick off our February film club. The way our film club works, for those of you who weren't with us last year, is that you stream the films on your own and then we gather to discuss them with an expert. And next week we will be discussing the short documentary Under God, which was directed by Paula Eiselt, and it explores the experiences of Jewish women who have been affected by the overturning of Roe v. Wade, as well as the lawsuits that are challenging Dobbs on the basis of religious liberty. And joining us will be one of the central subjects in the film, who's a co-founder of Hoosier Jews for Choice. And you can learn more and register at the link in the chat. And we'll also include it in the email that we send out tomorrow with the recording. And I hope that you will all join us. And until then, thank you and have a wonderful week. And thank you again, Sue and
Judith,
Solomon, for
thank you
joining us.
so much. Thank you.
Have a good night, everybody.
Bye.